culture, and they deny all scientific progress. One of the goals of ICERS is to send bridges between the both worlds, and this is what we want to talk about. We not aim at fixing epistemic problems that you can't never fix in 1 hour debates, but disciplines as knowledge systems should establish a dialogue to strengthen each other and enrich each other, not to impose to the others. The indigenous tradition is a millenary one, and so is the scientific one. They all have their wise people, their figures, their accomplishments, and their challenges for the purpose they are seeking, which is no other than the improvement and the betterment of communities. Dogmatic, closed knowledge systems suffocate the progress of knowledge. Open systems allow for novelty, and that means change and adaptation. Indigenous and scientific knowledge systems can work because they are open, and a open dialogue between them could be better for all of them. So thank you, Constanza, Tabea, and Wade, for being here in this informal debate. We're not going to look at the timing. We're just going to informally try to share some reflections around how these different systems of knowledge can work together. From ICERS, we are trying to topple down this pyramid with some hegemonic scientific evidence, and we're trying to have a cross-disciplinary debate, taking a step beyond not just a debate, not just a transdisciplinary debate, but also a transcultural, multicultural debate. So thank you very much for coming. We will listen to Tabea first, then Wade, then Constanza. Thank you very much again, and you've got the floor.
Sí, hay una presentación en PowerPoint, por favor. Gracias.
I think there's this presentation. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Tabea Casique. I represent here the organization of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon Basin, COICA. I'm going to tell you about bilingual intercultural education. So we, as indigenous peoples, we have been fighting for a long time for respect to our educational system, how we want our education to be. From the ministries and the state, we want them to respect the education the way we want it. In this regard, there is the bilingual intercultural education, which we have been championing for many years now. So I will tell you about my country, Peru. It is true that Peru is a multicultural, multi-ethnic country, but there's different peoples in it, and so for us, it is necessary to have education in our own languages. We want educational institutions to have bilingual teachers who can speak the native tongue as well, the local tongue, so that primary school children can understand and can listen from the teachers how they teach their language correctly. Because unfortunately, our education is really struggling. As for the background, of course, we have Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization, which in Article 26 says that measures should be adopted to guarantee that the members of indigenous peoples should have an education at all levels. So we have laws that protect us internationally, however, they are not always complied with in the states we live in. The education the educational system in Peru is not inclusive. There are many deficiencies. There's no integration, and sometimes because of the geography and distance issues, education can't reach to remote communities. Why? Well, they tell us there's no budget to cater for the needs of those communities because of the distance. Sometimes indigenous young people or children do not get any studies because they don't have access to education. And as for intercultural education, for us, it's not just about the language. There are other things, the customs, the experiences, the cosmovision of our elders that they teach us from our experiences, our life experiences. But then when a monolingual teacher goes to the school which does not belong to that community, well, that's really hard for us because the children, for starters, do not understand Spanish, and that's an added difficulty. And there's normally these teachers will have different ideas, different insights they try to impose on the children of our community, and they're not used to that. So these are all complicated issues, and for us, this is a significant hurdle, a significant difficulty. And as an organization, we're always alert, and we defend we should have an education which is appropriate for us, which is adapted, so that the children can understand also how important the knowledge of the own community is. Now, education is not just, it's not just the educational vision, but it also entails the psychological aspects, because in schools we don't know what kinds of families are there. There's probably a teacher with 20 different students coming from 20 different homes, and they don't know what's the situation of that kid. Sometimes the child lives in a situation of violence that happens to in indigenous communities, or sometimes the child is not well fed. Sometimes there's dysfunctional homes. Maybe the father is not there, not taking care of the kids, or other types of problems. And sometimes psychological attention is needed, and emotional attention is needed. And this is a hindrance for the kid. It is more difficult for him or her to access education, and that's something that is not taken into account. So what we request is that the language is respected. Again, that teachers are locals of our community. Also, that the appropriate teaching materials are provided, and that the education given agrees with the reality of our community. This is why we would also like some research on the ancestral knowledge of the communities coming from the elders, the wise people of these communities. But this research should be done in the community itself. It shouldn't be taken outside with our knowledge, because we are tired as indigenous peoples to being studied, but then they take away the knowledge and nothing is left to you for the benefit of our people. So there is legal frameworks protecting us, but still they are often not respected, not observed. There are also deficiencies again. We have a lack of bilingual teachers who can take up these jobs, these positions, and we as an association, we're also fighting for that, and we've got a plan to train young people, undergraduates or postgraduates, also in accordance to our reality. We are not against technology or science, that's okay, but we, as indigenous peoples, we need to articulate these plans without forgetting our customs and our identity. There's the identity first. I'm from that village, I belong there, and I also want to learn Western knowledge without leaving aside my traditional knowledge, and then bring it all together and try to make it better. So we've got experience in training young people in different subjects, such as currently we've got this project to train young people on climate change, sustainability, focusing on leadership tools. We have started in 2 countries, Peru, in Ecuador, 25 youths in each country, and these are 1-year programs for these young boys and girls, and it's done on site and also online remotely, and these young people are going to support their communities. That's the condition. So we are doing this silently as an organization, but we are not alone. We have external allies supporting us, such as IBOS in this case, the Simón Bolívar University in Ecuador, and the COICA. We got together with the support of the financial fund of the Swedish lottery, and it is kind of an NGO, so we don't a non-profit organization, and we try to serve our communities with this. So thank you very much. I'm here for the debate. Thank you.
Wait, adelante. Bueno, voy a explicar unas cositas en inglés.
Well,
with what we just heard, you know, when you look, the one element of the development paradigm that is sort of never criticized is education, Western education, but it all depends on how the education is delivered. If you think of Canada, my country, we've gone through this agonizing process of reconciliation where we've tried to come to terms with the fact that we tore children away from their families, forced them to speak another language, basically violated the human rights as public policy, as educational policy. And all of that was done with the quote-unquote best of intentions. And that's what's going on all around the world today, education as the best of intentions. But take a place like Kenya, where rich pastoral traditions go back 10,000 years, where drought is not some cruel anomaly, but a regular feature of climate. And in order to mitigate the impact of drought, families try to get at least one foot in the cash economy, which generally means educating one child, and generally that's a son. So the son, a product of this extraordinarily rich indigenous tradition of pastoral nomadism, goes to school. But the schools are controlled by the state or missionaries for whom the pastoral tradition is an embarrassment. So the kid comes into school as a nomad, may learn a modicum of literacy, mathematics, but in a context that teaches him to be ashamed of who he is. So he comes into a school as a nomad, graduates as a clerk, can't go back, but going forward means joining an unemployment rate of 50% for high school graduates as he drifts to the slums of Nairobi and tries to scratch a living from the edges of the cash economy. Now, the fascinating thing about that is that every indice of the global development paradigm has gone up. Urbanization has gone up, per capita income's gone up, literacy rates have gone up, but quality of life, of course, has collapsed. And all around the world, education is still presented, particularly in places like India, Pakistan, as less an avenue of opportunity than a vehicle for assimilation and acculturation. And that doesn't mean education is bad, but it has to be within the context of cultural sensitivity, which is what's going on in Colombia, thanks to the work of Fundación Gaia Amazonas. And this gets back to this whole idea. It's not the traditional versus the modern. It's about how all of us are going to live, and how do we find ways that all peoples can benefit from the best, say, of modernity and Western science, but critically, without that engagement, demanding the death of who they are as a people. And it gets back to a fundamental issue that even the title of this panel, in a sense, reflects the challenges of. We have this panel, Science versus Tradition. Well, think of what that means. Science, in fact, is a product of a very specific European tradition that we can go back to Aristotle, Descartes, and the moment when Descartes said that all that existed was mind and matter. We threw out all notions of metaphor, mysticism, and we deanimated the world. And eventually science made a house cleaning of belief, and the triumph of secular materialism became the conceit of modernity, and the idea that a mountain could be a deity was dismissed as ridiculous, and it created this whole way in which we treat the world environmentally. But on the other hand, we have science, and what are we saying? Tradition. Well, there's no such thing as tradition. There are 6,090 voices of humanity, each one of which represents an intellectual body of knowledge as complex, as complete as our particular Western lineage. I mean, when we talk about climate change as having become humanity's problem, it wasn't caused by humanity. It was caused by a very narrow subset of humanity with a particular worldview. And the reason, in the sense that the multiple voices of humanity are so important, is they exist to remind us that there are other ways of thinking, other ways of being, other ways of orienting ourselves in ecological space, and the power of their voices puts a lie to those of us in our own tradition who say that we cannot change, as we all know we must change, the fundamental way we inhabit the planet. All cultures are ethnocentric, faithful to their own interpretation of reality, and so we too are ethnocentric, and we tend to think of ourselves as the real world, and everybody else is a failed attempt at being us. But one of the great revelatory revelations of our time, the thing that might finally put the dagger into the heart of racism and cultural myopia, is ironically coming from science. Because within my lifetime, geneticists have proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always hoped to be true, and that is the fact that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is an utter fiction. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth, and we are all descendants of the same common human origins. And the important thing about that is that it suggests if we all are cut from the same genetic cloth, by definition, we share the same raw genius, the same mental acuity, the same human potential. And how that potential is expressed is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy in the realm of culture. The old Victorian idea that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized of the Strand of London, that humanity was some kind of pyramid with European society at the peak sloping down to the so-called primitives of the world, has been absolutely dismissed by modern science, ridiculed by modern science, shown to be an artifact of the 19th century, no more relevant to our lives today than the notion that clergymen had in that century that the earth was but 6,000 years old. And this stunning affirmation of the human spirit, and genetics has come to the fore to prove the truth of the central intuitions of anthropology. And that means that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being us, let alone failed attempts at being modern. Every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. Every culture's got something to say. Each deserves to be heard, just as none has monopoly on the route to the divine. So when we export Western education as some kind of panacea, we're actually often engaged in a kind of colonial act of acculturation and assimilation, and yet it is the one element of the development paradigm that often goes unquestioned. And yet if you look at a country like the United States of America, that country fails to graduate more than 50% of its students in its public education system in more than 20 major cities. So if they can't even graduate their own students, why are they exporting that pedagogy and that ideology outside of its own borders?
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I'd like to speak Spanish. My name is Constanza Sánchez. I lead law, politics and human rights at ICERS. I would like to discuss the matter of the panel, starting with education, which Tabea and Wade have already mentioned. And I'd like to start by talking about the hierarchy of knowledge or cultures, which Wade has also mentioned. As you know, ICERS, one of the E's in ICERS is education. We are the International Center for Education, Research and Service. So within that framework, one of our missions, one of our mandates is to open up spaces, to create spaces for practices related with traditional plants or the traditional uses of plants beyond their native uses. So in this process, in this educational process, I'm going to speak more from a personal point of view or collective from our organization, from our work. So I was saying, the first thing we realized is that in order to have the word education as part of the title of your organization, you've got to experiment a deep process of learning. All of us, starting each and every one of us. So the first thing we realized when we tried to create or find spaces, when I say spaces, I mean political, social, right spaces. So the first thing we realized is that, well, was it the first, the second, the third, who knows, whatever. We noticed that usually the fastest route line between, the shortest line between 2 points is not a straight line. What does that mean? We had to unlearn many of the things that we had learned in our own disciplines. You might know that one of the principles, the basic principles of our mission is to foster public policies, particularly from the perspective we use for human rights. We want to go towards public policies based on some principles such as evidence, human rights, sustainability, and the involvement of the communities. I'd like to tackle two of these, evidence and community involvement. As Bouso was saying at the beginning, we've tried to, first learn that evidence goes beyond the scientific evidence published on journals and papers. There are many ways to generate knowledge. ways which are not necessarily what we understand as part of the Western scientific method. What does that mean? That means that we have also moved on trying to find where knowledge could come from. Knowledge to bring about the social and political changes that we foster. There is a work, there is a bridge that we have at our own organization around what we call the science section, José Carlos Bouso, and the section of human rights. And with that bridge, we've tried to do some intense work to create some dialogue between scientific evidence and the promotion of human rights, and to then be able to convey it, to transmit it. This has taken us to work around the whole body of rights, of human rights, and one of them being the right to science, which is made up of the right to research, the right to carry out research about whatever might widen the knowledge of mankind, including knowledge that might require the use of substances which might be illegal, and also the right we all have to benefit from scientific research and scientific advances, even the ones which have been achieved through the use of these substances. Another important body of reflection was to try and break away, but rather than break away, our attempt to question the hierarchy of evidence. For example, in the case of another plant, cannabis, we've seen how public policies consider some evidence as acceptable evidence, evidence that comes from clinical tests and that gives us the right results, which is then published in journals and is supported by psychiatrists, whatever. Okay, they accept that. However, the knowledge of users of the plant or other plants, such as the one that brings us here, ayahuasca, the use for their own healing or for their own development, this might not be worthy of being considered evidence according to some public bodies. This is something else that we are trying to change. We want to change that perspective at the fora we take part in. Now, that was evidence. Now, for community involvement, we've also come a long way over the last few years. We have redefined many of the ways we used to get involved in public debate or in our own lobbying work. For this particular work, we've really seen how the fastest route between 2 points is not necessarily a straight line. This is something we've learned in our work with indigenous communities. We are not an organization with a long-standing tradition of work with communities, as you might know. Our role has been more that of a bridge. We've used the globalization of ayahuasca and other traditional plants. We've taken it as an opportunity to create bridges between native communities and people, facilitators who are outside native contexts. We also want to lay some bridges between societies in different places and between civil society and public bodies, be they national or international ones. That has been our role. We are not an organization that deals exclusively with indigenous communities. This is something that we are only now starting to do. We have a long way to go in that field. Now, something we've been learning in this dialogue is that the process might be as important or more than the result. When we work at the process, we tend to assess it in terms of result, and you forget about the process. Whereas our colleagues at Umiyak, who are here at the conference and who've had their own panel at Hall 1, they're constantly taking part in the indigenous space. In fact, the musical close of the day is going to be by them. Well, in this 2-year process of work with Umiyak, with this organization, and the people who act as their consultants, we've learned in these 2 years that the process really counts, and that the development of joint methodologies is very important. This is something that Tabea also mentioned. For us, as, let's say, people from the global north, it's very hard to understand or to accept that we need to change our methodology to strengthen our allies in other parts of the world. And also this strengthening of our allies and our learning from them makes us stronger. And that's also what I meant when I was saying at the beginning that the process, the path, the journey is sometimes longer, but it's clearly more fruitful and more truthful for our mission. And I think I'll leave it at that now. Okay, do you want to say anything amongst yourselves before we open up to the floor?
Si no comento yo,
Or I will. Well, in the title, we were not looking for any confrontation, really. It was the other way around. It would be more like an intercultural dialogue. What we were aiming at, that's what we are going for in ICERS. We also believe that tradition, if there's anything that can be called that, would be based on knowledge, and knowledge is always evolving, because when knowledge stagnates, then it becomes faith or dogma, and when something becomes a dogma, it no longer makes a contribution, I believe, to the common good, to benefiting from the evolution and development and progress. So I believe we have this tendency in contemporary societies to, well, we live better than ever, longer than ever, with better financial conditions than ever, with quality of life better than ever as well. And that's partly a consequence of scientific progress. But at the same time, we insist on underrating it and undervaluing it. But also the world is more globalized than ever, and contamination between knowledge, if you want to call it like that, also in the educational plan, because the word education is in the name ICERS, but research is also there. And I believe that in a global world, we can no longer think about epistemological facts. These are issues for philosophers to debate, but we want to act. We want to start actions because we know that this debate needs to happen. And in the context of traditional plans, it is probably more pressing than ever to have this debate, because it is the clearest expression of two knowledge systems bound to find an understanding when ayahuasca has already left the jungle and is now part of the global world. So I don't know if this dialogue between knowledge systems is possible or not. What do you think? Is it possible? Is it desirable? Well, I would like to specifically talk about medicinal plants. Although it is true, and again, we are not against Western knowledge, but we must take into account also the value of our knowledge as indigenous peoples. So the way we approach it is, of course, we want respect, we want recognition, acknowledgement of our wisdom, our knowledge with medicinal plants. And about health, we also believe that intercultural health is indeed necessary for us, because the doctors, the Western doctors, Western physicians, and traditional physicians, you can call them shaman or curandero, healers, whatever. So you've got those, and if a patient can skip Western medicine and go to traditional medicine and get better with that traditional medicine and heal. So laws are complex and it is difficult to articulate the health system in each country in Latin America. But this is a constant struggle of ours to ask to be considered and respected and not disregarded, the way we live and the way we work around our knowledge. So it should be articulated, taking that into account. But sometimes some people want to learn from our knowledge because they know it is effective, but because there's no studies or scientific trials proving that that is real, then they kind of look down on us. They think our knowledge is not good enough, and sometimes we want this, and sometimes it can't be done because the system in each state does not recognize us, and we can't apply it, even if professionals working in the communities, so in this case physicians and nurses and obstetricians, they do know about it and they apply it, but then when you go to a hospital there's more restrictions. But there's some professionals that value it. I can give you an example about the delivery, for instance. In delivery, there's many obstetricians that know that the traditional medicine is effective, and they also give the option, taking plants, some piri-piri, and some plants are used for this. So some of them who have worked with indigenous people, they know about it and they allow it. At what point these medicinal plants can be taken. But then some of them just shut down to this possibility. They say it's not allowed, and that's it. And this, for us, emotionally, we feel really bad. We can't understand how that's possible. And I actually know that my grandparents have used this for many years, and then they won't allow me to use it. Sometimes we have to hide out to do that, to use it. And we don't think that's good, that's right. But this is what we are working for. We're working for the system, for the Ministry of Education to include that in the common knowledge around health. And women women in these communities are also they also have this knowledge. Very few women actually drink the ayahuasca, but we have knowledge regarding medicinal plants for multiple purposes. So the women can be midwives or evaporators, depending on what kind of disease or condition you have, and they will diagnose it and use the appropriate plants for that. And that's the way we live in our communities. And this is somehow being lost with the young people because they're not very interested. I mean, their mom can teach them about this and that, but they're not interested. So this is why our knowledge has to be valued again within our community, within our villages, to be able to then teach it to external people.
Let me try to maybe broaden the discussion a little bit. It's natural that because we're at the World Ayahuasca Conference, we're focused on the challenges of cultural appropriation, of intercultural reverence for the plant. But I think it's important to sort of step back. And to me, what ayahuasca has always been, in a way, so important is not simply the way it's a vehicle for personal transformation or a vehicle for social solidarity in a community, but how the elaboration of it reveals another way of thinking, another way of being, another level of genius in the world. And this is what we see when we shine the ethnographic lens everywhere, slip into the seas of Polynesia and find navigators who can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon just by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of their vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern that can be read with the same perspicacity with which a forensic scientist would read a fingerprint. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. Slip into the mountains of the Himalaya and really experience the truth of the Buddhist science of the mind. A Lama once said to me that we in Tibet don't believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do. In other words, all around the world, we can see these expressions of our collective human genius made manifest in these extraordinary, culturally bound expressions. And that behooves us to step back and look at the dark backdrop of our age and the singular concern we ought to have beyond existential threats such as climate change, the fate of the oceans, the fate of the forest. But we often forget about the fate of ourselves. When each of you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on earth. Now, a language is not just a body of vocabulary or set of grammatical structures. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of every culture comes into the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual, ecological possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the day that you were born, by utter, total academic consensus amongst linguists, fully half aren't being taught to school children, which means they're on the brink of extinction. Now, there are many people in the dominant quarters of this world who say, wouldn't the world be a better place if we all spoke one language? Wouldn't communication be facilitated? Wouldn't it be easier for us to get along? And my answer to that is always to say, what a great idea. But let's make that universal language Nuptatak. Let's make it Yoruba. Let's make it Haida. Let's make it Quechua, whatever. And suddenly the native speaker of English, in particular, or Spanish for that matter, or Mandarin, begins to understand what it would be like to be enveloped in silence, to have no means or ability to pass on the wisdom of your ancestry or to anticipate the promise of your descendants. And yet that dreadful fate is the plight of somebody somewhere on earth every 2 weeks, because on average every fortnight some elder passes away and carries with him or her into the grave the last syllables of an ancient tongue. And we have this idea that this happens because these cultures are quaint and colorful, but somehow destined to fade away as if by natural law. Nothing could be further from the truth. In almost every instance, these languages are disappearing and these cultures are being threatened, are living dynamic peoples that are not fading away, but they're being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that observation is actually an optimistic one, because it suggests that if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. And part of what's going on at a conference like this is the very fact that you have non-Indigenous people coming to the fore to support Indigenous people in their legitimate aspirations, both spiritual, social, and political. And that's really where the ayahuasca, spirit weaves us all into a single cloth of destiny and life.
Sí, yo por hacer un breve comentario siguiendo el...
Just a brief comment, if I may. I was saying a brief comment following on to what Wade was saying. I believe that what we're trying to do, and what I believe we are achieving at a conference like this, and it's something we're also trying to do in our everyday work, is we're seeing ayahuasca as an opportunity to talk about many things. For example, I come from, I used to work in the reform of drug policies, and then you go on to something like ayahuasca, and obviously what your background wants to impose on you is, that you see what happens is that there is a molecule in this medicine which is fiscalized, which is the object of legal concerns, and that's what the issue is. And all of a sudden you realize that I am extremely reductionist in my response, as reductionist as the state of the matter that we aspire to change. So in this dialogue with communities, one learns that ayahuasca is not just an object of public policy. It isn't just an object of study. It is also a subject for policies. It is a subject for study. It is a tool for decision taking. It is a tool for community life. It is a tool for transformation of the group, of the community, and the collective which works on the subject. And that is something which is really powerful, and it is part of the globalization process of traditional plants. All of a sudden, they get to a society, or they get to us, to the so-called global north, and we label them. It's psychoactive, therefore toxic, therefore it should be prosecuted, it should be forbidden, it should be eradicated from the face of the planet, because that is our drug controlling mentality. And the answer developed by those of us who are against those impositions is Well, we need to, they give us a political proposal, and at the same time, it's a trick to get us into a very reductionist response. And we don't want that. We want something else. That's why we are here. And for example, at the indigenous space upstairs, we're doing things in a different way. This morning we heard there that what communities are worried about, it's not the prohibition of ayahuasca or any other traditional substance. What worries them is commercialization, it's cultural appropriation, it's the protection of that ancestral knowledge. That's what concerns them. That's what they're telling us upstairs. The fact that they travel here, all the way here, to share with us their concerns, that is deeply transforming for all of us here, because we're here to learn, to listen, to change. And with that, they're giving us new tools to suggest new bridges, new dialogues of wisdoms. And perhaps it's not a matter of seeing whether this is possible or not, and I do believe it is possible, it is being possible, but rather this dialogue at one point might stop being a dialogue and might start being something more organic, more integrated, and might become just something else, something which is not either Western scientific knowledge or traditional knowledge. It could just become a new being, unnamed as of yet, but which I believe is being incubated at events like this and many others. Yes, in fact, it was a bit of a trick question whether this knowledge or exchange of knowledge is possible, because the reality is that it is happening. It is already happening in other spheres of knowledge, particularly in the world of the environment. There are increasingly more and more experiences where there is an organic, fluid dialogue between indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. Recently, we saw a paper published with satellite photos of the areas of the planet which had been burned or which had been the subject of fires, and the biodiversity in those fires. And it was seen that the fires which were controlled by indigenous communities, the biodiversity in those areas was much richer than when the fires were controlled by scientific means. So scientists are learning from indigenous communities how to control fires to gain biodiversity. So the exchange of knowledge is not negative to the indigenous communities or to the scientific world, although that may have been the case in the past. It's a bit like what Wade was saying, comparing it to Kenyan communities. There is an economic inequality or a trade inequality, because the history of humanity is the history of trade, and when trade is not equal, that's when inequalities start. So perhaps we should start being a little bit more modest, more humble, and perhaps we need to include gender perspective, race perspective, and indigenous perspectives with research methods which are not colonial, which include in the team indigenous peoples, and where indigenous wisdom is accepted as a scientific tool. I think that there are experiences along these lines, and we are trying to support them. Perhaps to finish on an upbeat note, we could think of ideas to engage this indigenous input, unless it is too ambitious a question. I know it's not an easy answer. If I may.
Way of knowing, and it's a vision, a perspective on life. It's a little like when people get hung up about religion versus science. Well, there's really no conflict between religion and science, because science asks one question, how, and religion asks the question, why. And so there's no conflict there. And similarly, the scientific method it's just a way of looking at the world, and it answers a number of questions, and it leaves other questions unanswered, and it satisfies some elements of the human desire, and it leaves some still, barren and in search of satisfaction. So I mean, we can live in a world of multiple realities, and we always do. And so it's not a zero-sum game. The contributions of different elements and facets of the imagination. And the critical thing is to remember that even when we use the word science and tradition, it's a little sort of silly, because when I think of the curanderos, the maestros, the shamanes with making ayahuasca, if that process of discovery, if that process of chemical manipulation, if that intuition about the synergistic interactions between molecules of these dazzling compounds, if that's not science, I'm not sure what science is. And all of these shamanes are natural philosophers who have used the genius that we all share and applied it to an understanding of something specific to their needs, which is an understanding of the botanical realm upon which their lives and their cultures depend.
Okay, thank you. Sí, bueno, vamos a terminar.
Well, we are going to finish. It's 4 minutes early, but Wade has to leave us, and he's already running 10 minutes late. So, once again, thank you. I would have loved to spend some 3 more hours discussing the subjects. I hope we will have the chance to do so again. Thank you.
Gracias.